The morning sun warmed my back as I knelt in the soft dirt along my driveway, planting the last of my tomato seedlings. After 15 years of grueling 80-hour weeks at my law firm, I'd finally found peace in growing things. The feel of soil between my fingers and the promise of fresh vegetables kept me grounded. That tranquility shattered when I heard a sharp voice. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I looked up to see Nancy Williams, head of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed over her designer blouse, her highlighted hair unmoving in the breeze. "Good morning, Nancy," I said, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "Just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the neat rows of raised beds lining my driveway. "This is completely unacceptable, James. Front yards must be properly landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in backyards, hidden from view." I took a deep breath. Nancy had turned our once friendly neighborhood into a battleground of petty rules and surprise fines over the past 5 years. "Nancy, my property deed predates the HOA by 30 years. I've got grandfather exemptions on most of these rules," I replied, standing up, suddenly aware of how my dirt-stained jeans contrasted with her immaculate appearance. "That's not how it works," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." She took multiple photos, her fingers flying across the screen as two neighbors walking their dogs slowed to watch. "I've read every page of the HOA agreement," I said calmly, "and I've kept all correspondence acknowledging my exemption. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She waved dismissively. "Save it for the hearing. You'll get a formal notice by tomorrow. Remove this mess or fines will accumulate." As she marched away, Mr. Jenkins from across the street gave me a sympathetic look. He'd had his own run-in with Nancy over his mailbox color. That evening, a bright orange violation notice was taped to my door. A $50 daily fine until the unapproved agricultural activity was gone, with a hearing set for next week. I added it to my growing HOA nonsense file, but this felt more personal, more targeted. My phone rang. It was Alina Ramos, the sweet elderly widow down the street. "James, dear," her voice crackled, "I saw Nancy harassing you. You're not the first. Last month, she fined the Thompsons $500 because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic." My blood boiled. "That can't be legal," I said. "It wasn't," Alina confirmed, "but they couldn't afford to fight it. Nancy's gotten bolder since her friend Robert became the HOA's lawyer." I thanked her and hung up, sleep eluding me that night. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. My family had owned this land before selling to developers in the 1970s, and my father had mentioned retaining certain rights. I was rummaging through attic boxes when I heard heavy engines outside. Rushing to the window, I froze. 3 massive bulldozers blocked my driveway, with Nancy smirking beside them, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit. A crowd of neighbors gathered, watching wide-eyed. Grabbing my phone and HOA documents, I stepped onto my porch as Nancy's triumphant smile sent chills down my spine. Whatever game she was playing, she'd just made a serious mistake. "James Anderson," Nancy called out, her voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so severe that immediate action has been authorized." The man beside her stepped forward, exuding confidence. "I'm Robert Taylor, legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates HOA," he said, gesturing to my garden beds. "These unauthorized structures are being removed under Section 8.3 of the bylaws, immediate remedy for public nuisance." My neighbors watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Patel covered her mouth, and the Henderson kids stopped their bikes to stare. I walked down my front steps, mind racing for a way to stall. "Mr. Taylor," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you might want to check your legal footing. Those aren't structures, they're temporary garden beds, and you're about to make a very expensive mistake." Robert's smile faltered slightly. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Anderson. We have full authority under the HOA covenant." Nancy stepped closer, practically glowing with authority. "James, this stubbornness is unnecessary. Agree to remove this, pay the accumulated fines, now up to $300, and we can move on." The bulldozer engines revved louder. The closest operator looked uneasy, glancing between us. "Before you proceed," I said, pulling out my phone, "I'm recording this, and I've texted my associate at the firm to join us." "Oh, and you should know something else about this property." Nancy rolled her eyes. Save the legal mumbo-jumbo, James. Nothing you say will stop this. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up and the neighbors parted as Sheriff Martinez stepped out, followed by a woman with official county records. Nancy's confidence wavered. What's going on? We don't need law enforcement for an HOA matter. I smiled for the first time that morning. Nancy, you don't understand whose driveway you've blocked, or whose land your bulldozers are on. Miss Abernathy, the county clerk, struggled with large property maps, spreading them across the sheriff's car hood as neighbors inched closer, murmuring. The bulldozer operators cut their engines, sensing the shift. These are the original survey maps from 1973, she explained, pointing to yellow documents. And this is the property sale agreement between the Anderson family and Willow Creek Development Corporation. Nancy pushed forward, her bravado fatting. This is ridiculous. Whatever ancient paperwork you've dug up can't override our HOA authority. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. Ma'am, I suggest you listen carefully. Miss Abernathy adjusted her glasses. When the Anderson family sold this land, they retained specific rights, mineral rights beneath the entire 200-acre development, all utility easements under the main roads, and exemptions from any future HOAs for 5 properties kept for family members. I stepped forward. My house is one of those 5. Robert frantically flipped through his briefcase. That's impossible. The HOA covenant applies to all properties. Miss Abernathy smiled patiently. Your HOA was formed in 1995, Mr. Taylor. These agreements were registered in 1973. Your covenant can't override them. Nancy's face turned red. This is a trick. Even if James has special status, he can't violate community standards. Actually, Sheriff Martinez interjected, county law says he can do whatever he wants with his property as long as it's within zoning regulations and vegetable gardens are legal. The crowd grew. Mr. Jenkins recorded on his phone. Mrs. Patel whispered translations. Nancy turned to the operators. This changes nothing. Proceed. The lead operator shook his head. Sorry, ma'am, I'm not risking my license without a court order. Nancy snapped. I'll get one. I leaned closer, voice low. Those bulldozers are on my easement. That's trespassing. And since you brought them to damage my property, Robert grabbed her arm, whispering urgently, fear flickering in her eyes. Sheriff, I said calmly, I'd like to file a report for attempted property damage and trespassing. Sheriff Martinez nodded. We can take care of that right now. Nancy exploded. This is outrageous. The HOA has governed this neighborhood for decades. You can't just claim special privileges. A frail voice cut through the tension. It's not sudden, Nancy. Elena Ramos stepped forward, leaning on her cane. Some of us have known about the Anderson exemptions all along. The old board respected them, but when you took over, Nancy glared. Stay out of this, Elena. Your Christmas decorations violation hearing is next week, or have you forgotten? Neighbors gasped at her threat to the beloved 82-year-old widow. Elena smiled sweetly. Oh, I haven't forgotten anything, dear. My memory's excellent. I remember when your husband built that shed 2 feet over the Johnson property line and Robert dismissed the violation. Administrative discretion, wasn't it? The crowd murmured louder. Nancy's face flushed as hostile gazes turned her way. Robert checked his watch nervously. Nancy, we should continue this in private. Schedule a proper hearing. There will be no hearing, I interrupted. My property is exempt. Those bulldozers need to leave my easement now or I'll add charges. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Folks, let's keep this civil. Miss Williams, Mr. Taylor, direct these operators to remove their equipment. Mr. Anderson will file that report once the area's clear. Nancy looked around, realizing she was losing control and her audience. The neighbors, once intimidated, now watched with satisfaction. This isn't over, she hissed at me, not by a long shot. As the bulldozers backed away, Elena touched my arm. James, dear, there's something you should know about the HOA financial records. What about them? I asked quietly. She glanced around. Not here, too many ears. Come by my house this evening. Bring those property documents. We've only scratched the surface of what Nancy's been up to. As Nancy and Robert retreated to their car, I saw fear in their eyes. Whatever they'd tried to hide by targeting my garden, they'd awakened something bigger. The last bulldozer rumbled off, leaving my tomato plants intact. Sheriff Martinez approached with his citation book. Want to file that report now? I watched Nancy's car speed away. Absolutely, and Sheriff, contact the county prosecutor. This might involve more than trespassing. Elena squeezed my hand. 7 tonight, she whispered. Bring a calculator. You'll need it when you see what I found. Neighbors dispersed, many examining my garden beds with new interest. Nancy had turned my modest plot into a symbol of resistance. I just wanted to grow tomatoes. Now I was about to uncover something that would change our community forever. Blood rushed to my face as the bulldozer engines faded, replaced by the sound of my neighbors whispering behind curtains. I needed to act fast. With shaking hands, I called the county clerk's office. "Martha, it's James Anderson. Remember those old land deeds we discussed? I need them at my house immediately. It's an emergency." Nancy strutted across my yard, pointing at my garden and gesturing to the operators. Robert nodded, checking his clipboard. "You have 30 minutes to say goodbye to your little farm," Nancy taunted, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Maybe next time you'll follow the rules." I stood my ground. "Don't touch anything until Martha arrives." "Who's Martha?" Nancy snapped, her smile faltering. "You'll see." The next 20 minutes were excruciating. Neighbors gathered across the street, some sympathetic, others enjoying the drama. Mrs. Jenkins filmed everything. Martha's county vehicle pulled up 27 minutes later. Not alone she'd brought the property records team and 4 boxes of documents. Nancy's smugness wavered. "What's all this?" Robert asked, stepping forward. I helped Martha spread the yellowed maps across my car hood. Smiling as the oldest one, dated 1887, revealed my great-great-grandfather's original land purchase. "Miss Williams," Martha said, adjusting her glasses and pointing to a boundary line on the 1887 map, "are you familiar with the Anderson Land Trust, established in 1923? Nancy crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous. Our HOA bylaws clearly state." "The bylaws don't override county or state law," Martha interrupted. I pointed to a paragraph on a 1978 document, the land sale contract when my grandfather sold the parcels that became Willow Creek Estates. "See this clause? While the surface land was sold, my family retained all mineral rights and utility easements. Plus, my property is exempt from future neighborhood covenants." Robert snatched the paper, eyes widening. "That's impossible." Martha explained. "The Andersons kept mineral rights beneath the entire 200-acre development, utility easements under the main roads, and exemptions for 5 family properties, James's house included." Nancy sputtered, her face reddening. "Remember that special infrastructure fee everyone pays to the county each year?" I asked quietly. "That goes to my family trust for using the easements we still own. Those bulldozers are parked on my legal easement, trespassing." The operators exchanged nervous glances. One shut off his engine. Nancy lunged for the documents. "Let me see that. This has to be a trick." A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Sheriff Martinez stepped out, nodding to me before addressing Nancy. "Miss Williams, I've received reports of attempted property destruction and trespassing here." "This is HOA business. The police have no jurisdiction," Nancy hissed. "Actually," Martinez said, pulling out his citation book, "when Mr. Anderson's grandfather sold this land, disputes fall under county jurisdiction, not HOA arbitration." Robert's composure cracked. "Nancy, we need to stop this now if they're right." "It can't be true," she shouted, but fear flickered in her eyes. The crowd gasped as another car arrived. Mrs. Jenkins live-streamed, her phone held high. "James," Nancy's tone turned sickly sweet, "surely we can discuss this reasonably." Martinez approached. "Move those bulldozers immediately." The operators climbed back in, eager to leave. Then the unexpected happened. The car's back door opened and Alina Ramos stepped out, leaning on her cane, her eyes fierce. "Stop those machines right now," she commanded. Nancy rolled her eyes. "Alina, go home. This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Alina's laugh was sharp. "When you threatened me with a $500 fine for my Christmas lights, you made it my concern." I hadn't seen much of Alina since helping with her late husband's paperwork, but she turned to me now. "James, show them the 1978 map." Surprised, I found the document. She pointed a gnarled finger. "See these 12 properties, mine included. We're part of the original purchase agreement. James isn't the only one exempt from HOA oversight." Martha leaned in. "She's right, the original homesteads carry the same protections." Nancy's face contorted. "That's absurd. We've regulated those properties for years." "Illegally," Alina said simply, addressing the crowd. "Harold, Susan, Derek, your originals too." 3 older residents stepped forward, confused but curious. "Is this true?" Harold asked. "They can't find me for my bird feeders," Susan added. Recognition dawned as they realized they'd been bullied into paying unnecessary fines. Robert whispered urgently to Nancy, her expression darkening. Alina continued, "How many of you have been harassed by this HOA, fined for ridiculous violations, threatened for minor issues?" Hands shot up. Mrs. Jenkins's live stream comments exploded. "This isn't just about James's garden," Alina said. "It's about how Nancy's HOA has abused its power." Sheriff Martinez nodded. "I've had more complaints about this HOA than all others combined, threatening elderly residents, ticketing guests, entering properties without permission." Nancy pushed past Robert. "These allegations are false. We enforce rules everyone agreed to." "Except we didn't all agree," I said quietly. "And you knew that, didn't you?" The tension thickened as the Bulldozers retreated, the operators wanting no part in this escalating fight. "This isn't over," Nancy hissed at me, her voice low and venomous. "The board will hear about this and take appropriate action." Alina reached into her large handbag. "Speaking of the board, I have something everyone should see." She handed me a thick manila folder. As I opened it, my legal training kicked in. Bank statements, transfer records, articles of incorporation stared back at me. "Where did you get this?" I asked, stunned. Alina smiled faintly. "My late husband was an accountant for 50 years. When they fined me for my Christmas lights, I got curious about where the money went and started requesting public records." I flipped through the pages, each more damning than the last. The HOA had collected special assessment fees for a community pool renovation that never happened. Over $300,000 had vanished into WCE Holdings LLC. The final page listed the managing members, Robert Taylor and Nancy Williams. Nancy lunged for the folder. "That's private HOA business." Sheriff Martinez stepped between us. "Ma'am, step back right now." Neighbors gathered closer, eager to see what caused the commotion as Robert slipped toward his car. "These are serious allegations," Martha said, peering over my shoulder. "If accurate, this is criminal territory." Nancy's facade cracked. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she snarled. "My husband plays golf with Judge Brennan. This will disappear by tomorrow." I held her gaze. "Check the news, Nancy. Judge Brennan retired last week after an ethics investigation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins zoomed in with her phone. Alina whispered, "There's more, so much more." As the sheriff took statements about HOA abuses, I wondered how deep this corruption ran. My hands trembled as I reopened Alina's folder later that evening. Bank statements bore sticky notes marking odd figures. The HOA had siphoned an extra $300 monthly from each house for the pool, unchanged for 3 years. "Over 300,000 missing," I whispered, tracing the numbers. "Where did it go?" Alina leaned closer. "Keep turning pages." The next sheet showed funds funneled to Williams Taylor Consulting, Nancy and Robert's company. "They've been stealing for years," she said softly. "How did you find this?" I asked, still reeling. Her eyes sparkled with pride and sorrow. "Frank taught me to read statements. When Nancy fined me $200 for leaving my lights up 2 days late, I got angry and dug into the HOA papers nobody reads." I pulled out my phone. "We need to tell everyone now." "Wait," Alina said, stopping me. "Look at the last page." It revealed a plan to use HOA rules to force 5 elderly homeowners to sell below market value, with Nancy and Robert buying and flipping the properties for double. "They're targeting people who can't fight back," Alina said, "like me alone, scared by legal threats." Sheriff Martinez, listening quietly, shook his head. "This is fraud." I stood resolute. "I'm calling an emergency neighborhood meeting tonight." 3 hours later, the clubhouse overflowed, chairs filled, walls lined, windows crowded. I connected my laptop to the big screen, displaying the evidence. "These people we trusted stole over $300,000, I said, voice steady despite my pounding heart. "Money for our pool, roads, playground, gone." Gasps echoed as I showed the transfers. When I revealed the scheme against elderly neighbors, shouts erupted. "Where are Nancy and Robert?" someone yelled. "They were invited but didn't come," I replied. "Their absence speaks volumes." Mr. Jenkins, a retired judge, stood. "I move we vote to remove the board and elect temporary leaders until proper elections." The vote was unanimous, 76 hands raised to dissolve the HOA board. As neighbors signed the legal documents I'd prepared, my phone buzzed with Nancy's name. I stepped outside. "You've ruined everything," she spat. "You think you've won because your family owns some dirt. This isn't over." Before I could respond, she hung up, leaving me wondering what she meant. I stood in the cool evening air, Nancy's cryptic threat echoing in my mind. What could she do now that the neighborhood knew the truth? Back inside the clubhouse, the energy had shifted. Neighbors formed committees, one to audit HOA finances, another to simplify rules. Alina sat at a table explaining her findings to an enthralled crowd. My phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. "Check your security cameras now." I opened the app and my stomach dropped. Two figures in dark clothing were in my front yard, Nancy's blonde hair and Robert's tall frame unmistakable in the dim light. They yanked up my garden plants, tossing them across the lawn. Nancy looked straight at the camera, smiled, and slashed a finger across her throat before they sped off. I showed Sheriff Martinez, who immediately called for a patrol car. As neighbors crowded around my phone, another text arrived. "This is just the beginning. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you never planted a single seed." "Can you arrest them for this?" I asked. "Trespassing, vandalism, and with these threats possibly more," Martinez replied. "But James, be careful. Cornered people can be dangerous." Alina placed a frail hand on my arm. "You're not alone anymore. None of us are." Looking at the determined faces around me, strangers turned allies, I knew she was right. Nancy and Robert had held power for years, but we had the truth and each other. My phone buzzed again with a photo attachment. I opened it and the blood drained from my face. Old documents proving my property's exemptions, with originals burned so easily scrawled in red across them. My heart raced. Those papers were in my attic. I called Martinez over. "They've been in my house or they're bluffing," he frowned. "We'll check it out. Stay here until we clear your property." The patrol car reported no sign of Nancy or Robert at my home, and the originals were safe, but the threat lingered. Back at Alina's house that evening, as promised, I brought my documents and a calculator. She handed me another folder, more financial records. "After our call last night, I kept digging," she said. "Look at this." The HOA had been overcharging dues for years, funneling excess into WCE Holdings. "They've stolen closer to $500,000, I calculated, stunned. "And see this." Alina pointed to a line item, legal fees paid to Robert's firm, inflated beyond reason. "They've been double-dipping," she said, "using HOA money to pad their pockets while bullying us into compliance." I leaned back, processing. "This isn't just theft, it's a racket. We need to take this to the county prosecutor." Alina nodded. "There's more. They've been forging signatures on board meeting minutes, approving their own schemes." The depth of their corruption was staggering, but so was our resolve. The next morning, I met with the new audit committee at Mr. Jenkins's house. We pored over Alina's records, cross-referencing with HOA statements. "This matches," Jenkins said, tapping a transfer. "They've been siphoning funds since Nancy took over." Susan Winters, another original, added, "I paid a $1,000 fine for my gazebo money that went straight to them." The committee agreed. "We compile everything for the prosecutor." My phone rang. Martinez. "We found Nancy's car abandoned downtown. No sign of her or Robert, but we're tracking them. Stay vigilant." I thanked him, a chill settling in. That afternoon, I returned home to find my front door ajar. Inside, my HOA file was gone, only the empty folder remained. A note in red ink sat on my table. "You can't prove anything without these." Panic surged, but then I remembered. I digitized everything for the meeting. Smiling grimly, I texted Martinez and the committee. "They took the bait. We've still got the evidence." Nancy thought she'd won, but she'd underestimated us again. The theft of my physical HOA file should have rattled me, but knowing I'd backed up everything digitally turned my fear into determination. I called Sheriff Martinez immediately. "They broke in and took my paper records, left a note saying I can't prove anything without them," I said. "But I've got scans of it all." Martinez's voice tightened. "That's breaking and entering on top of everything else. Send me the notes, foe. I'll add it to the case. We're closing in on them." I texted the image and alerted the audit committee. Mr. Jenkins replied, "Good work, James. We're meeting the prosecutor tomorrow. Bring your digital copies." I spent the evening triple-checking my files, emailing duplicates to Alina and Jenkins for safekeeping. The neighborhood buzzed with activity. Word of Nancy and Robert's latest move spread fast, fueling our collective resolve. Mrs. Patel stopped by with chai, her eyes fierce. "They fined me for my son's basketball hoop last year." "I want them gone," I nodded. "We're almost there." Sleep came fitfully, my mind replaying Nancy's throat-slashing gesture, but I woke with a clear purpose: end this. The next morning, I arrived at the county courthouse with the committee, Alina, Jenkins, Susan, and Harold, carrying laptops and printed backups. Prosecutor Linda Hayes greeted us, her expression grim as she reviewed our evidence. "This is textbook fraud, embezzlement, and coercion," she said, flipping through Alina's financial breakdowns. The forged minutes and inflated fees alone could put them away for years. Add the break-in and threats, they're done. She paused. But we need Nancy and Robert in custody. Any idea where they might hide? I thought of Nancy's bravado, her husband's golf connections, her confidence in Judge Brennan. She might lean on old allies, I suggested. Check country clubs or properties tied to WCE Holdings. Hayes nodded, making notes. We'll issue warrants today. Sheriff's already on their trail. As we left, Alina squeezed my arm. Frank would have been proud of us. I smiled. He taught you well. Back home, I tended my battered garden, replanting what I could salvage when Martinez called. We got a hit. Robert's credit card pinged at a motel 30 miles out. Deputies are en route. My pulse quickened. And Nancy? Still looking. Stay cautious. She's unhinged. That evening, the neighborhood gathered informally at the clubhouse. Less a meeting, more a rally. Jenkins updated everyone. Warrants are out, evidence is with the prosecutor. We're rewriting the HOA charter, exemptions honored, no more special fees. Cheers erupted. Susan raised her hand. Can we sue for our fines back? We're exploring it, I said. Restitution's possible if they're convicted. My phone buzzed, Martinez again. Robert's in custody. Sang like a bird, claims Nancy masterminded everything, says she's planning something big to finish this. He doesn't know where she is. I relayed the news and the room tensed. What could she do now? Harold asked. I pictured the red-scrawled threat, originals burned so easily. She might target the documents or us, I said. Lock your homes, check your cameras. The crowd dispersed, vigilance replacing celebration. Late that night, my security app pinged, motion at my back door. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and checked the feed. A figure in a hoodie prying the lock. I dialed 911, whispering, someone's breaking in, hurry. The figure looked up. Nancy's furious face glared into the camera before she bolted. Sirens wailed minutes later, but she was gone. Martinez arrived, jaw tight. She's desperate. We found gasoline cans in her abandoned car. She might have planned arson. My stomach churned. My house, my garden, the originals. She's targeting me to scare everyone else, I said. Then we'll catch her first, he replied. As he coordinated with deputies, I texted the committee. Nancy's on the run, tried my house. Stay safe, we're close to ending this. The night stretched long after Nancy's failed break-in. My nerves frayed, but my resolve hardened. Sheriff Martinez stationed a deputy outside my house, and I spent hours reviewing camera footage, texting updates to the committee. Alina replied, she's unraveling, desperation makes mistakes, we've got her. Dawn broke with a call from Martinez. We caught her. Gas station clerk 20 miles out recognized her from the warrant. Deputies nabbed her trying to buy burner phones with cash. Relief flooded me. What's her story? Denies everything but Robert's testimony and your evidence bury her. She had matches and a map to the courthouse in her bag, likely planning to torch records. I exhaled. It's over. Legally, yeah, she's booked fraud, embezzlement, vandalism, attempted arson. Robert's facing the same minus the arson. Prosecutors confident. I thanked him and called the committee. Jenkins whooped, time to celebrate and rebuild. That afternoon, I met Hayes at the courthouse. Plea deals are off the table, she said. With $500,000 stolen and coercion of vulnerable residents, they're looking at 10 years minimum. Restitution's in play. Fines might come back to you all. I nodded, picturing Susan's gazebo, Harold's bird feeders, small victories reclaimed. The neighborhood transformed over the next week. We held an official meeting, electing a new HOA board, Jenkins as president, Alina as treasurer, me declining but promising legal advice. The charter was rewritten. Exemptions honored, fees transparent, no bulldozers for petty disputes. Mrs. Patel spearheaded a community garden project, inspired by my battered beds. Neighbors donated seedlings, and my tomatoes became a symbol of defiance turned unity. Nancy and Robert's trial loomed, but their absence lifted a weight. Streets buzzed with chatter, not fear. One evening, Alina invited me over, handing me tea and a thin folder. Last piece, she said. It was a letter from her husband's old firm, confirming they'd audited WCE Holdings years ago. Nancy had buried the report. Another nail, I said, grinning. You're a force, Alina, she chuckled. Frank always said I'd find trouble worth fixing. We toasted to him, the neighborhood, and the truth. My phone buzzed. Martinez. Nancy's lawyer tried a last-ditch motion claiming your exemptions were forged. Courthouse records shut it down. Originals are safe. I laughed. She never quits. She's done now, he said. See you at the trial. Weeks later, I stood in my front yard, replanting the last seedling. The trial had ended, Nancy and Robert convicted, sentenced to 12 years each, ordered to repay over $600,000 with interest. Neighbors waved as they passed, some tending their own gardens. Mr. Jenkins stopped by. HOA's running smooth. First meeting was about potlucks, not fines. Susan joined us, smiling. Got my gazebo refund, thanks, James, I shrugged. We did it together. That night, the clubhouse glowed with our first potluck. Tables groaned with food, kids raced outside, Alina held court with stories of Frank. My phone stayed quiet, no threats or bulldozers to dread. I'd wanted peace to grow tomatoes. Instead, I'd unearthed corruption, rallied a community, and found something better, trust. As I bit into a tomato from my salvaged crop, Mrs. Patel clapped my shoulder. Next year, we'll win the county fair with these. I laughed, picturing Nancy's smug face replaced by this. A neighborhood reborn. The bulldozers were gone, the dirt was ours, and the harvest was just beginning. Looking around at faces once cowed by petty tyranny, now alight with purpose, I realized we'd grown more than vegetables. We'd cultivated something unbreakable. Nancy thought she'd bury me under her rules, but she'd misjudged the soil she stood on. It wasn't just mine. It belonged to all of us, and together we'd made it thrive. The sun dipped low, casting gold over Willow Creek Estates. Not a battleground anymore, but a home.